Me into the life of a child. Take a look and see. Makes him cry, what makes her smile? Some were hurt too hard. That can make trust so hard to find. A fear that must be healed by reaching back within the mind. My child, see my hand reaching to you, back through time, with the love you needed then, but could not find. Try to take hold of it now, and understand that our future depends upon our joining hands. If you will join me, we'll learn to grow up together. Through the pain we'll see and understand a little better. The way you saw things then is not the way you'll see them now. Please give it a chance and take some time to learn how. My child, see my hand reaching to you, back through time, with the love you needed then, but could not find. Try to take hold of it now, and understand that our future depends upon our joining hands. That our future depends upon our joining hands.
Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for what we hope will be an informative, moving, uplifting, and inspiring conversation about children's rights and welfare. We're joined by experts tonight in the field who are going to teach us about systems and policies in New York and beyond, give us insight about honoring survivors' voices and cultivating resilience, and offer us best practices for creating sacred spaces in the Jewish community and beyond. First, to set our container, our kavanah, and our spiritual grounding, I'd like to invite Danielle Pitkoff of Sacred Spaces to offer us some opening words.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Hello, everyone. I'm going to offer this brief kavanah, this intention setting, to help ground us in this virtual space together and to continue our work of safeguarding children in the Jewish tradition. So as we launch into this evening's event, may we be guided by the words of the Aleinu prayer, L'takein olam b'malchut Shaddai, to repair the world under God's kingdom. Knowing that our children are the future of our community, we thank each person who has joined us in this space for dedicating your time to this sacred work. Coming together with strength and gratitude, we hope to ensure the safety, well-being, and health of our children in order to fulfill Isaiah's teaching, V'rav shalom banaich, great will be the peace of your children. Let us recognize those who come to this space as survivors, and together may we work transparently toward community action, healing, and resilience.
And let us all say, Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Danielle. And we will fully introduce Danielle and welcome her back later in our program. So now I'd like to introduce Julia Davis and Hassanah Smith of the Children's Defense Fund New York, who will be setting an historical context, offering us some insights about systems relating to child welfare in New York and exploring the current policy environment. I'd like to introduce them fully, so I'll be reading their bios to you. Julia Davis joined the Children's Defense Fund in 2018 as the Director of Child Welfare and Youth Justice. She works in partnership with young people, defenders, service providers, and advocates to advance policies that support children and youth who may have had contact with the child welfare system. She spent 2 decades working on behalf of young people through civil rights litigation, public policy research, and public engagement campaigns. She has a bachelor's degree in biology and community health from Brown and a law degree from Cardoza School of Law at Yeshiva University, and lives in Brooklyn, with her husband, a city educator, and their 12-year-old son who attends Kolot Chayenu. Hassanah Smith serves as the Youth Leadership and Advocacy Coordinator of the Children's Defense Fund New York office and brings a plethora of experience working with youth in marginalized communities. She designs civic education workshops, boots on the ground advocacy work to enhance the lives of those belonging to the low socioeconomic backgrounds. She's also served as program coordinator for the Muslim Community Network, bridging the gap and building partnerships between Muslim youth communities and New York's local city government. She has also worked in her hometown of Newark, New Jersey, managing grants used to combat blight in the greater Newark area. She holds a bachelor's degree from William Patterson University and a master's in public administration from Rutgers, Newark. She plans to get her JD too, in order to continue to positively impact the lives of others, including children in New York. It is my great honor, privilege, and pleasure to welcome Julia and Hassanah, who will be having a conversation together about the work they're doing here in our great city.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hassanah and I are so moved and thankful to be with you after what sounds like an extraordinary weekend of learning and sharing and deep understanding in the interests of children. And as an organization rooted in the civil rights history and in the religious leadership history of the movement for children at the Children's Defense Fund, I just want to acknowledge all of you and thank you for this time. And I'm going to turn it over to Hassanah. We're gonna have a dialogue a little bit about the moment that we're in child welfare, and then some of the things that Hassanah does in her extraordinary work serving young people in New York.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hassanah. It's truly a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting us to speak. This is actually my first virtual speaking engagement in this context, so I'm pretty excited. Thanks for the opportunity. And so, Julie, you ready to kick it off? All right. So let's have our friends in the audience. We're going to open the chat now. Start by answering a few questions, and then Julie and I, again, will have a dialogue, answer some, and move throughout. So to start, when I say child welfare, what thoughts or phrases come to mind? So I'll ask it one more time. When I say child welfare, what word or phrase or thoughts come to mind?
And while we're looking at what's coming through the chat, we're going to try and tie some of these ideas to the policy moment that we're in, but it's coming straight through, right? Safety, human rights, social services, the protection of children. So Hassanah, where do you want to start?
Let's start. I see children and youth in risk. I also see social work. So let's kind of start in that area. That's been something that's really popular down there.
Yeah. So when we talk about the child welfare system in the country, in the United States, we're talking about laws that happen at the federal level and at the state level and at the city level. And we're also talking about systems, meaning like government agencies and relationships with nonprofit providers. And all of this is about 100 years old. And this 100-year-old system is about sort of identifying kids who are at risk, meaning children who are living in families where they may not get what they need to grow and thrive, and then also to identify children who may, whose whole family may need services. Sometimes think about child welfare, people think, oh, it's only about foster care, about pulling children out of their homes and taking them into the custody of the state. But child welfare is increasingly trying to look earlier and earlier in the life of a child as issues emerge to try and like wrap a whole family with services and supports. So when you think that way, we're talking about kids, we're talking about their biological family or their family of origin. We're also talking about their community, their neighborhoods, their kinship networks. We're also talking about like government operators, legislators, the governor, the people who are on the city council in the city of New York. All these people are really part of a bigger child welfare system. But we're also talking about kind of a history that's related to race and racism in the United States. And we'll get into a little bit more about that.
Okay, so when you talk about child welfare, what is this system? What is the purpose and who is impacted? So you can also throw that in the chat as well. Julia, I'll pass it along to you.
Thank you. So like I'm seeing things in here about broken, political. And when we talk really about who is impacted by this system, we can think through some of the numbers together. We're talking about in New York City, about 2,000 to 3,000 children who are in foster care, who've been removed from their families. But of course, the system starts before that with a call to a hotline about a family. And when you look at those calls, what we see is about 90% of all the calls made in the city are about Black and Latinx families. Black and Latinx families do not love their children less, do not do a poor job of taking care of their children, live in communities that are over surveilled. And so what you see is like a lot of parallels between child welfare and the policing system. What we see though is that while many of us think about the child welfare system as being about abuse, it's largely about neglect. So what we're seeing is about 60% of all calls that are made to a hotline about child welfare really have to do with inadequate food, shelter, clothing, what really sounds much more like a community poverty problem and much less about an individual child or family. And so we're constantly in the child welfare system shifting our lens back and forth between the individual child and the family and then in the broader community.
Okay, so you did talk about like who is impacted to an extent. So I guess we'll kind of wrap it with, who are the children in New York's child welfare system and what are their actual needs?
Yeah, so we talked about sort of what we call overrepresentation, that so many Black and Latinx families get caught up in the child welfare system. They're much more likely to have their children removed. And much more likely to be one of the 50,000 kids in foster care in New York State. So when we talk about the needs of kids in care, or even the kids who are just coming to the attention of the child welfare system, we have this overlay, right? We know they're much more likely to be poor. They are much more likely to have lower levels of educational attainment or educational success. Once you have a situation where you remove a child from her family, which is what happens in foster care, you trigger a deep trauma that we all talk about. And I know that trauma has been part of the conversation you all have been having. But what we see is young people, especially as they age out of foster care, become teenagers and sort of move through the system, they stay that long. Those kids really need not only this focus on education, mental health, trauma-based services, but type of work that Hassanah does, which is really about connections with adults in communities that help bridge that time into adulthood. So with that in mind, I want to flip it and ask you, Hassanah, you work with young people at the Children's Defense Fund, especially young people that have experienced poverty. Maybe some of them have been in the child welfare system or the shelter system. Who are those young people and what do they?
Thank you. So, to your point, when we talk about who was impacted, it's predominantly Black or Brown children, and that is who we serve in the greater New York area. Again, those who have been in foster care, those who have been in shelters. And so we at CDF believe that in order to be those successful adults, children need to have that fresh start. And though we don't get them at a very young age, we still take that model and we kind of work with high school children who are going to then matriculate into college. That's the overall point of the program. It's called the Beat the Odds program. And what we try to do is give them these soft skills, a lot of leadership skills, but also build it in or around community engagement. So they not only can advocate for themselves, but they have the tools they need to go on to college, say, hey, this isn't right. And it's oftentimes skills that are missed or things that they can't have. Again, we talk about kids who are in the system already or their family belong to the lower socioeconomic kind of playing field. And so we're trying to give them the best head start possible.
And many of those young people really, have been part of some of our policy advocacy. They've written op-eds about the need during COVID to expand protections for emerging adults, kids 18 to 21 that may have been forced out of the foster care system, but who made a really powerful argument in Washington and got the federal law changed so they could stay in foster care if they needed to. They could get resources and education, vouchers and financial supports during this really vulnerable time. When I think about sort of your vision of youth development, how young people grow and thrive, like how does Beat the Odds really, the program that we run at CDF, how does that program really sort of reflect your vision of what youth development should be for vulnerable?
So what my vision is for youth development, to your point, given all of the systemic issues, is one, giving them the power, showing them the power in doing that work and to be and to articulate it and say it. But here at CDF, what we do with the Beat the Odds Scholars, like Julia said, we'll incorporate their involvement in like a lobby day. So they get to work on issues that are solely reflecting what's happening, police and schools. Because of these COVID times, we have students, we talk about the digital divide. They didn't have access to computers. So how could they, make attendance and all these systemic issues? And so we try to get them to not only advocate and talk, but then we'll go rally up and talk to the legislators in Albany to say, hey, this is what's happening. And then have them firsthand talk about their experience. This is one thing to talk about it all day, but to have the people in the room who are impacted directly makes all the difference. So to wrap around back to the answer is, my vision is to have them put their best foot forward and be able to voice their concerns so that they're not only more civically engaged youth, but then they can pay it forward and do it for the generation that's coming up behind them.
Absolutely. I mean, young people's leadership really is about their leadership now and their leadership in their future, right? Like this moment now where they can advocate on behalf of themselves for the things they need, whether it's in child welfare or in education, mental health, especially in this moment of COVID. And we talked a little bit about in child welfare that kids who come into the system are often at a deficit in the education system. And then once they come in, they tend to get disconnected from school, especially if they're moved or they're not staying in their biological home. The longer they stay in care, the worse their educational outcomes are. And I know that you're also working on freedom schools at Children's Defense Fund, which has movement. Tell us a little bit about how you think Freedom Schools fits into all of this.
Sure, thank you. So Freedom Schools is a very important component of Children's Defense Fund. So we provide a lot of literature for children's ages K through 12. And it's not just anything like Shakespeare or Edgar Allan Poe. It's narratives that reflect what they go through on a daily basis. So a lot of Black authors or, Black and Brown authors, and it just makes sense to the student and it impacts them. And what happens is these kids get this really hands-on approach. They're provided free breakfast, free lunch. So everything they need to just thrive and survive throughout the days. It's a summer program. They have it. and they track the success of these students. And we have seen, and we'll drop the link, after we finish speaking so you can check it out. The kids have dramatically improved their reading skills, their leadership skills, because it's just beyond reading a book and you're learning, but they have dramatically improved in just their whole educational experience because they're getting this supplemental help in the summer. And the whole point of freedom schools, it dates back to the civil rights time where Black and brown people weren't really given everything. They had the segregated schools. They were getting the books that was just used or torn. And so it was an opportunity to supplement what they already knew, but also give them life skills beyond the classroom. And freedom schools, provide those tools to help these young people really just thrive moving forward.
Yeah. And so I think, as we all shift in this conversation, I'm so excited to hear from the rest of the panel about sort of working with individual children, the opportunities to protect children that we're all connected to in our lives. And I guess, what I would say in transition now is just that we would love to have as many of you as are interested in working on our campaigns to try and improve the child welfare system, and as well as working with us to serve young people in New York City through our Beat the Odds and through our Freedom School mission work. All of this is really about sort of strengthening the safety net and creating communities where children can grow and thrive. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you guys. This has been a great opportunity to talk a little bit about our work, and we're really looking forward to hearing what's next.
Thank you so much. Rabbi Mira, go ahead.
So it was, let me just see. Thank you, Julia and Hassanah, for setting the historical context and offering us some insight into systems for child welfare. So friends, if you have any questions for Julia or Hassanah, please send these to me on the chat. Rabbi Mira Rivera. Now, I'd like to introduce Avital Kaye Tzadok of Haruv, who is being welcomed by the sirens of New York City. There you go, with fanfare. And how did we come into each other's orbit? So around October of last year, when we were there in COVID restrictions and isolation, I received, this really good news from
Rabbi Mira, I'm actually gonna, you're gonna steal my anecdote because I'm gonna talk about that in a second.
So am I gonna save it? But Rabbi Edith, I just want to hold Rabbi Edith from Haifa. Just, I was dreaming, how are we gonna do Shabbat with the child way back in October? And then we got connected and we said, how can we make this happen? And so here you are now. So my pleasure to introduce you. And Avital Kaye Tzadok currently resides with her family in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and is a visiting scholar at the University of Oklahoma. She is a certified supervisor and group facilitator, working for over 15 years with at-risk adolescent girls and young women. So the work focuses on hope, resilience, and post-traumatic growth among survivors of childhood abuse and neglect. Avital is also a lecturer and head of the field of instruction unit at Rupin Academic Center in Emek Hefer in Israel, and chief coordinator of Girls for Girls mentoring program at Tel Aviv University. And she has taught graduate and undergrad courses in social work. Group facilitating in a training program at the Bob Chappell School of Social Work in Tel Aviv University. Avital earned her BSW, MSW, and PhD from Tel Aviv University and postdoc at Hebrew University. A great pleasure to have you and Romamu's deep dive into the child. And we look forward to your wisdom on lifting up survivors' voices, promoting resilience and empowerment of children.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Mira. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So thank you for that introduction. Yes, I'm going to talk about cultivating resilience and lifting survivors' voices. And I want to start with a little anecdote. So I came here to Tulsa, Oklahoma with my family in August. This is, as you can see, this is us at Natbag at the Israeli airport, my 3 kids and my husband and 2 cats that came along with us. And arriving to Tulsa in the midst of the pandemic, that's quite a relocation experience, let me tell you. And one of the things that I had to do arriving here is, over here at Haruv, what we do, we train professionals in the field of child abuse and neglect. So policemen, educators, social workers, psychologists, medical teams, whoever. And COVID obviously threw a big wrench in that. So I had to figure out, okay, let's start, our new partnerships as well as old ones. And I reached out to a friend back home who I know is a rabbi and is connected to a lot of rabbis here in the States. And I'm thinking, okay, this is a good contact, right? I'll start. I send an email, I introduce myself. So Rabbi Edith really helped me and send that email. I think there were probably hundreds of rabbis that received that email from me. But I do want to tell you one thing. For sending that email, there's only one person that responded to that email. That's you, Rabbi Rivera. So that's kind of sad on one hand, but it's telling you something about how special Romemo is, because Rabbi Mira immediately responded. We met and she said, hey, we're your partner. Whatever you want, we'd like to do, you have us as a partner. So thank you, Rabbi Mira, for that. Throughout my career, I've really been troubled by the question of resilience. How can we help survivors reach resilience? And I've been really working on that, both at the research level, because that's what my PhD was about, but also the practice level. So I call myself sometimes a bad academic or a bad researcher because I cannot stay in the books only. I have to, be involved in real life practice. And so a little about talking about resilience, I've noticed, and I've had the pleasure of really introducing this topic a lot. And I kind of feel that there's a misconception a lot of times, because when we talk about resilience of adult survivors of childhood abuse, a lot of times there's this notion of maybe they're these superheroes, maybe they're, these unique human beings with superpowers, or that wear kind of a special shield that protects them against, all the trauma. And the truth is that, that image actually cannot be further from the truth. So we're not talking about superheroes, and right now we already know from the research a lot about resilience, because this has been researched over the past 50 years or so. And we know now that resilience really sits in the overlap and really is the result of 3 types of factors: those individual characteristics, familial characteristics, as well as wider social environmental characteristics. So we're not talking about, that person who's so strong and determined, that might be part of the picture, but it's never the full picture. The full picture is that we really need all 3 types of protective factors, as we call them. And I want to emphasize something else, and I've learned this from Professor Michael Unger, who's a resilience researcher up in Halifax, Canada, who's done really amazing work for over 40 years researching this topic, and I just love reading whatever he writes. And listen to this quote by Professor Unger: "The cumulative impact of individual traits typically accounts for less of the variance in children's outcomes than systemic factors like the quality of a child's family, school, or community." So you have to understand that when we're talking about resilience, actually, us as surrounding, as the environments are so important in determining whether later on this child will be resilient or not. So a lot of it is actually up to us. And after doing a lot of research internationally with many other scholars, Michael Unger has published this list of 7 protective factors that have been found to help at-risk children reach resilience. And not only maltreated ones, but even more, which speak more generally about at-risk children. So looking into access to material resources, of course, and of course, relationships with significant others, identity, allowing a personal and collective sense of purpose, self-appraisal of strengths, as well as weaknesses, aspirations, beliefs, etc. Experiences of power and control, cultural adherence, social justice, the experiences that relate to finding a meaningful role in the community and social equality, as well as cohesion. So I'm going to use this really as a base for what we're going to talk today. And I do see that there are some comments in the chat that I'm not able to see right now, so I'll be able to refer to them later once we do Q&A. So I want to bring 3 examples from my professional life and things that I have done over the years that I think kind of can help understand how we can implement these principles in practice and not just talk about them and read about them. So the first example I'm going to give is the Girls for Girls mentoring program at Tel Aviv University, Israel. And this program was initiated and headed by Professor Mira and Dr. Michal Komem, and Professor Golan is actually still running the program. And so I was very lucky and fortunate to be a part of this program for 11 years. I started out as an undergrad student back in 2002, and I remained there for 11 years. Even when I graduated, I remained there as a social worker and went on to do my graduate degree and PhD while working in the program. And what that program does is it takes young women and adolescents ages 16 to 24 and brings them into Tel Aviv University. They come from all parts of Israel once a week and over one academic year, and they learn how to become mentors, how to help other younger at-risk girls. And all of these girls and young women have gone through adversities, trauma. Many of them have unfortunately been abused or neglected. Once I was doing my PhD, and those of them who were over 18 filled out some questionnaires, and then I sadly discovered, was kind of devastated even to find out that 50% of them had gone through childhood sexual abuse. So the idea of them going through maltreatment was a huge part of the program, but the program at the same time kind of builds on their resilience, strength in helping and turning those hard experiences into actually a leverage of hope and now helping other young girls. So that was a huge part of me, my professional identity, and still I think is. I finished my position in the program in 2013, but I want just to go back to these 7 protective processes and show you how within this program, of course, we would start the day by eating, and later on the graduates would be helped with some more available resources. So really focusing on relationships, identity, power and control, cultural adherence, and all of these protective factors, I think, were actually there in that program. The second example that I want to bring to you today is an academic course that I've initiated at Rupin Academic Center, which has been my academic home for the past 6 years. And this course is called the Shelanu in Hebrew. Those of you who speak Hebrew, it's an acronym for Shutafot Lomdot Naarot V'Studentiyot. In English, our course, students and adolescents study together. So this was the group, and the group was made up of adolescents ages 16 to 18 who were considered at risk and in touch with social services in the surrounding areas. Half of them were adolescents, and half of the group were social work students. After the first year that I taught this course, the second year I taught it, I actually had a co-facilitator who is one of the graduates of the first course, so a young adolescent as my co-facilitator. And the idea really of this course is to look at what we traditionally look at in terms of who the teacher, who the student, and how learning looks like, and really kind of put question marks on that, and even kind of turn that upside down, because the idea is I'm not a teacher there. We're learning about adolescence, and we're learning about being an at-risk adolescent, but we're doing it while we're learning from the girls themselves, not from me. And so we would start the meeting by sitting in a circle and introducing a topic. And then later on, the girls and the students would be working in pairs or in groups of 3, and they would get an in-class assignment to complete. And after we would come back, we'd all have a really nice, not really nice, but a small dinner together. And finally, they would, each pair or group of 3 would go in the front of the class and present what they have learned from each other to the rest of the class. So, and that was a 14 session course. And so I think if you look back at these 7 protective processes and you think about this course, you can see that, well, some material resources in terms of that dinner, and of course, a huge focus on relationships, identity. Again, power and control, they get to choose, unlike other educational systems, they get to choose if to be in this course, they get to choose whether they want to continue, how they want to participate. So they get to choose everything, and believe me, once they get in, they don't want to leave. We try to be use cultural adherence in terms of all the different cultures represented in the group, and of course social justice and cohesion. The last example that I'm going to mention is something that we're doing right now here in Tulsa, Oklahoma through Haruv, and it's an initiative we've called Experts by Experience. And in this initiative, we're now training a group of women survivors of childhood maltreatment to really be a part of Haruv's trainings and to represent the voice of survivors while we train professionals to work with survivors in different aspects. So I've had the pleasure of co-facilitating this initiative with Dijon Knapp, who's a licensed clinical social worker, and my Haruv USA coordinator, my partner in crime, as I call her. And we've already used Experts by Experience in a lot of our training, even though these people have not participants of our group, but providing training on neglect by Amanda and Gregory, who's both a licensed clinician, but also a survivor, telling about her experiences. And again, with another training, this is just examples that I'm giving you, another training that we had on domestic violence, and we incorporated the voice of both a clinician and a survivor. And just last week, we hosted a clinician and a survivor from California telling our professionals about ASCA support groups, which stands for Adult Survivors of Childhood Abuse Support and Self-Help Peer Support Groups. So really incorporating survivors' voices has been kind of my mission. And we use this quote with our Experts by Experience that we found and we love. One day you will tell your story of how you overcame what you went through, and it will be someone else's survival guide. And that's from Brene Brown. So looking back at these 7 protective factors, I think that a lot of them are actually also appearing in our Experts by Experience initiative that is happening right now. So what question remains open for me? I think that the question that remains, are we willing to listen to survivors' voices? Are we willing to listen in a meaningful way, a way that is more than just anecdotal, but that truly engages survivors and allowing them spaces to participate, contribute, share their unique knowledge and experience? This has been my lifelong mission, and for a call of action, or a call for action, I really want you to take these 7 protective factors, because every one of us can help cultivate resilience, and you can see how it's done, and you can put yourself in a space where you can give some of this to survivors, because statistically they are all around us, and I think they need us. And I want to say just last thing, that a lot of times when we talk about survivors of childhood maltreatment, we talk about them in context of maybe therapy or a clinical setting. But I want to say that survivors aren't sick. Survivors may be hurting. That is true, but they are not sick. And we need to, although I'm not against therapy in any way, I think that's great and that's a great resource, but we need more resources that are outside the clinics. And I think the fact that a lot of these initiatives were based out of universities, colleges, really telling survivors that they belong, at the best places that we have as society that can offer them. So I know of only one way to fight darkness, and that is with light. That's, I think, what we are trying to do. Thank you so much for inviting me. And this is my email if anyone wants to reach out, and I'll be happy to answer some questions at the end of the panel.
Amen. Toda v'toda. Thank you, Avital, for teaching us the importance of lifting up survivors' voices and the methods by which we can do this and promote resilience in children. This is the work. It's so important, and we're so grateful for you. I'm grateful to Rabbi Mira for connecting us, and I'm so grateful that you're here. And 2 years running, right? We're going to keep it going. So thank you. Thank you so much. If you have a question for Avital, please send that to Rabbi Mira Rivera in the chat. We will have Q&A for all of our panelists toward the end. And now I would like to bring back our esteemed colleague, Danielle Pitkoff of Sacred Spaces, to introduce us to the Aleinu campaign and program, to give us insight about systems for prevention, further insight, to offer further best practices for creating sacred spaces, and who's going to provide us with some very relevant, extremely relevant calls to action. I'm going to share her bio now. Danielle is a program manager at Sacred Spaces, where she leads the Aleinu Safeguarding Our Children campaign, an innovative web platform to standardize youth safety practices across Jewish youth serving organizations. She's also a core member of the case consulting and training team, advising leaders of Jewish institutions as to how to prevent and respond to child maltreatment, harassment, and other abuses of power. As the former co-director of the Johns Hopkins University's Sexual Assault Resource Unit, she worked on a 24/7 crisis hotline, facilitated university-wide trainings, led campaigns for Title IX policy reform, and ran weekly workshops supporting survivors. She holds a degree in writing seminars for Johns Hopkins and was selected to be part of 2019's Jewish Week 36 Under 36. And she also plans to continue her work, of course, building resilience by exploring community level trauma and healing. So I want to express my gratitude for you again, also being with us again, Danielle. We are so blessed to have you with us in community. And without further ado, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lauren, for the introduction. And wow, I'm just feeling so inspired by the other panelists and by everybody sitting on this call and really taking the time to be together tonight for our children, for our teens, and just working towards safety and uplifting survivors' voices as well. So I'm going to just hopefully add on to what was said before me by sharing a little bit about a program that all people who are involved in Jewish youth serving organizations can be part of. And I will share my screen. Okay, can you see it all right?
Yes.
Great. So I'll just share a little bit of context about myself and how I found Sacred Spaces and what Sacred Spaces is to start. So as Lauren mentioned, I began my work on college campus supporting survivors of sexual assault and advocating for Title IX policy changes at the university level. And through this work, I was exposed to a certain type of institutional betrayal where over and over survivors shared with me that the initial trauma from these sexual assaults was exacerbated greatly when they were faced with disbelief, threats, retaliation, or just simply inaction by the communities that they were part of. And seeing this really ignited my desire to address that compounded harm that is caused to individuals when their organizations, when their communities, when their systems really fail to support them. And at the same time, as a spiritual person and a person who grew up in Jewish communities, I was seeing the way that unique angles of harm, or the unique ways that harm played out in faith-based communities, were also operating. And I was blessed to have been connected with Dr. Shira Berkovitz, who's the CEO and founder of Sacred Spaces, who at the time was really building out what it looked like to have a systemic response to abuses of power in Jewish institutions. So what do I mean by talking about, this institutional betrayal in faith-based communities? I'll just share a little bit about an article that Shira wrote called Institutional Abuse in Jewish Communities, and where she really illustrates the common barriers that Jewish organizations face when responding to incidents of harm. And so she breaks it down into the psychological, legal, and halachic, or Jewish law or religious factors that are at play when a Jewish organization, so a Jewish synagogue, a day school, a Jewish summer camp, are responding to people who come forward or to reports of whether it is child maltreatment, sexual abuse, or a policy violation that might happen that is being caused by a person who has a lot of spiritual authority in the community, or is even just occurring in the community in family units that are brought forward to an institution. So you might be familiar with some of the examples listed in the psychological and legal buckets, right? It is common in our culture to doubt survivors, to have cognitive dissonance, or just being very hard to believe that somebody could cause this harm against a child, or many of the legal factors that are at play when somebody comes forward. But Shira added on to that and built on the work of many individuals who talk about instances where in Jewish communities, we might manipulate religious text or tradition to cause further harm or to cover up an instance of abuse. So maybe we talk about the concept of lashon hara, of the prohibition against gossip as a way of silencing victims, or the concept of tzniut, of modesty, of saying, it is immodest in our community to talk about child maltreatment. And in some ways, if we're not speaking about it, that's going to prevent people maybe from coming forward, or for an organization handling it properly. And the role of rabbinic authority is something we see across faith communities, where there's a person with extreme power in a spiritual way, that either because they are causing the harm themselves or because they are not responding, it may cause further spiritual injury to an individual on top of the harm or trauma that they've currently experienced. So it's a little bit of a background of the kind of systemic factors that we're seeing in religious institutions. And through that, Shira really and the team at Sacred Spaces sought out to create, in some ways, a response to these barriers, because at Sacred Spaces, we support Jewish organizations to take proactive steps in preventing abuses of power and setting up systems so that when harm occurs, there's an ethical and holistic response. And so we're really trying to map out at Sacred Spaces the ways in which organizations can do the opposite of manipulating Jewish text, and rather rely on our Jewish text and tradition to guide us in ethical and moral response to people who are coming forward. And here I was told that last year at Shabbat of the Child, it was something that people appreciated, which were our 5 characteristics of sacred space. And you can see them here, but the idea is really that we are working on balancing safety with the dignity of all individuals involved, and trying to create a response rather than dividing a community in responding to an incident, lays out a roadmap for transparent handling, with the eventual goal of strengthening the entire community in the process. So our partnership with Jewish organizations takes many forms. We do trainings, and we do a lot of organizational policy development. So rather than policy at the federal level, we're talking about creating very clear shared expectations in a community for what is appropriate behavior and what we can rely on from each other to create cultures of safety and respect in which everybody feels safe. And so this is some of the work that we do across the lifespan, but in our youth-focused work, we began creating one-on-one guidelines with organizations that follow many of the policies that are outlined by the Centers for Disease Control in their guide on getting started with youth-serving organizations. And so that brings us a little bit to Aleinu, because in this work, we were working one-on-one and realized there are so many institutions out there that really don't have a basic sense of what their children and teens can expect of them when they join an organization, or what parents can expect from every synagogue, from every school and camp that they're sending their kids towards, in terms of, what are the communication guidelines between adults and children in that space? Do peers work on codes of conduct between each other? What are the basic expectations in terms of, if you were to bring something forward, how would the institution respond? And do they lay that out in a transparent way on their website? Or how are they communicating that this is of value in their community? So anyway, we were doing that work and we said, we need to scale this work. So we built Aleinu, which I'm happy to share is something that every person on this call, if you are affiliated in any way with a Jewish organization, can bring back to their institution, because Aleinu is a virtual platform that guides Jewish organizations through 10 best practices in developing child protection protocols, but also in shifting culture. And so what this is really a website. It's meant to be do it yourself, to bring the barrier of entry much down so any organization can participate. And we set you up with the very start of forming a child safety committee, which is making sure that we are not trying to combat an abuse of power by centralizing the control in the response to the power, right? Rather, we're going to decentralize who's responding, and we're going to create a committee of individuals that is made up of multiple people, not just people who are working in your institution, but volunteers. We're going to have a teen voice on that committee. We're going to talk about what it looks like to have survivors who are interested in being part of the work open to being on that committee, and a group of individuals who are going to constantly prioritize moving forward this work. And best practice 2 on creating opportunities for community dialogue also sets up the rest of the work to be in context of making sure that the entire initiative is about getting feedback from voices in the institution and saying that we are doing this in a way where we can speak about it and have shared language, also through Jewish text. And so a lot of this work is grounded in Jewish text and values. And you see the rest of the best practices. I don't need to go through them just yet, because I think maybe I'll just share a little bit, but we can come back to it in the Q&A. But just to give you a sense, each organization that registers gets their own platform where they get to track their progress. Through it, every person in the organization can have access to it, and they can share the worksheets and resources that come up when you open a web page. It gives you guidelines and training videos. And so a little bit about how this program is really grounded in the work, grounded in Jewish text and tradition, because that's kind of where we started in our guiding questions. How do we make this a program that fits the unique needs of Jewish organizations? And so one thing to note here is at the start, Sacred Spaces partnered with Jumpstart Labs on a survey of child protection policies in Jewish overnight camps and Jewish day schools. And at the time found that only 58% of Jewish day schools had child protection policies, and nearly a little bit more than that in Jewish overnight camps also did. So this was something where we knew at the time organizations, even if they were mandated to have these policies, may not have had them. And when questioned further of what the policies included, weren't necessarily comprehensive. And so part of the work in developing this was trying to understand where Jewish organizations were in terms of those policies and expectations. And so we created a Cheshbon HaNefesh resource, where this is a word that translates to an accounting of the soul, but we've talked about this process in terms of an organizational reflection to take stock of where you are with this topic, because prevention efforts can't take root if there's currently a cover-up that is happening, if there's current survivors in the community who have been harmed and there has not been justice or discussion about what has happened there. So there's a lot of deep reflection that happens at the start of this work to make sure that you're building off a foundation of strength and not one of harm. And each of the best practices are grounded in a Jewish quote, along with Jewish text studies that are throughout the program. And yes, so currently this program is open to organizations in New York City, Long Island, and Westchester. If you register by April 30th to join a summer fall cohort, So if anybody on the call is interested in helping bring this program to their organization, please feel free to reach out to me, because I'm happy to answer any questions about it. And really the idea is about building a movement so that there are shared expectations across communities. So we're in New York, but we hope for this to be a national program where any community member can look at the best practices, and if they see their institution is participating, to really go to the institution and say, I know you've committed to implementing these. Can you show me the work in this? Or can I be part of this work in your community? Or how are we outlining for organizations how they're going to incorporate teen voices into the work, because it is ultimately meant to serve and protect them. And so I will end there because I think I gave you a quick sneak peek into what the program is, but I am just, again, want to reiterate how grateful I am to be in this community with everybody speaking, and really want to call for, this action to make sure that we are taking transparent action and doing any of the calls to action that have been named already on this call. Every step, I think, really makes a big difference in terms of the lives of the people that we're trying to help and support. So thank you.
Amen. Toda, again and again. Toda, Danielle. So beautiful and so comprehensive. So I hope everybody heard loud and clear Danielle's call to action for both individuals and for Romemu as a community. We couldn't get more relevant, more local, and more homegrown than that. I'm so excited. And what I want to do now, in addition to thank you deeply for sharing Elena's best practices for creating sacred spaces, engaging youth, and incorporating, of course, Judaism into our prevention work, is remind people, even as we're about to begin the Q&A, that if you have questions for Danielle, you still have a minute to send one or two of those directly to Rabbi Mira Rivera in the chat. And before we move on, I'll just let you know that for now, one thing you can do if you are interested in getting involved with in-house is email socialaction@romemu.org, which is in the chat, and we'll be there again with child safety or children's rights, creating sacred spaces. We'll recognize any of those. And we'll call those, and there'll be a meeting very soon. So thank you so much, Danielle. And now the great and wonderful Rabbi Mira Rivera will facilitate the Q&A with our wonderful panelists.
So starting with Danielle, right? And we're going to just go backwards. And if other questions come in for Danielle, we will we'll skip around. So Michael asks, how does Sacred Spaces and Aleinu work with Jewish communities and organizations that have no interest in opting into these best practices? And the other question B of that is, how do they partner with activists like those of Tzadok?
Great questions. Thank you. So the truth is, Sacred Spaces partners with organizations who want to work with us. So our partnership is with those who are looking to do the work and need the resources to do the work. That being said, in a lot of our thought partnership work, we do try to break down and create shared language, across Jewish denominations for the moral and Jewish imperative to do the work. So while we are not going to go after an organization who does not want to partner with us, the hope is that through our work and for creating many resources for individuals who are in communities where their community doesn't want to do the work, we try to empower those individuals with language and resources and guides to start creating some of the dialogue within their community, which we really hope will eventually reach leadership at the institution who would then want to partner with us. So I guess that's the first question. Do you mind repeating the second part of the question?
Tzadok is an organization, like how do you partner with activists like those of them?
So we are so deeply grateful for our partners at organizations like Zaka and like other organizations who are doing work advocating for federal policy change. While that's not our work in-house, because our partnership is with the organizations and policies at the organizational level, we build on and refer to and collaborate often with organizations like them.
And I guess popularizing, these really difficult subjects. I mean, the forward and, all of our Jewish networks, right? And I remember being told that the pulpit is an important place, right? As are all our media, right? And rather than keeping this as, a verboten kind of subject, to bring it up as
Exactly.
sacred language, yes, and sacred engagement.
That's a perfect example of a way in which we might help an individual who wants to bring the work, right? We'll have sample sermons on the topic that they can bring to their clergy at the organization to speak about it, or we'll have ways to incorporate language around, I know Romamus used this around the Mishaberach prayers and incorporating survivors healing into those prayers. So exactly, creating community dialogue at any level.
Thank you. And to any of our panelists, how do you communicate with family members who would also be included, right, and in the communal family trauma experience? So to any of you. How is resiliency then, taught to other family members?
You could all answer this for 20 minutes each.
Yes.
Who's first? Hassanah?
Okay. I could take a stab at it. So how can families be more resilient in the household is a question, right? For starters, I think it's important that, like, I even think about like my upbringing and coming up, and parents oftentimes think that, like, it's my way or the highway, right? They put on that mentality, and so just allowing like communication and allowing a safe space rather, even if it is your child, I think that truly helps in dialogue, as far as making sure your kids in your household is good. But when we talk about the work itself, building resiliency in the household, so like maybe you're more fortunate in your household than maybe like your child's peers, and so giving them that kind of space where it's like, hey, everyone isn't as fortunate, and so to kind of be open-minded or to even be an ally in a sense will truly help building that resiliency for generations to come.
So I haven't worked a lot with families personally in the programs that I mentioned and talked about today, and I think it's a complex question, because a lot of the young girls and young women that I have worked with, a lot of the maltreatment actually happens in families. So we need to consider that. If abuse is happening in the family, that's a different story than if abuse is happening outside of the family, in terms of treatment and in terms of raising resilience. But I think one guideline which we definitely need to all consider is that if a child discloses anything, we always believe that child. I mean, that is our guideline, and we tend to sometimes, we have these defense mechanisms that make us think maybe they're exaggerating, maybe they're just, they dreamt it. We always believe children, and personally, from my research also on adult survivors of maltreatment, this issue of whether they were believed or not is so important to them, and remains with them for many, many years. If, for example, the non-abusive parent, did they believe them? It's a huge part of what we do with survivors once they disclose. So I think we still have a lot of work as a society to work on that issue. It's hard it's hard to believe. I know it's hard, but we have to.
So talking about this collaboration, for example, right, between the teacher on site and perhaps a social worker, what we call like interdisciplinary or like kind of like a therapeutic approach, right, to a situation. How does let's see, hold on. What is it ethical to notify? Okay, the question is it ethical for notification of a parent seeking treatment to make a referral to CDF or Haruv Institute? I know, for example, they said, like you said, if you hear something, believe it and get your resources. Go ahead, please.
Okay, I'm not sure if I heard like to report, would they reach out like to CDF?
Yes.
Okay, so we provide our direct service is like kind of solely with like just scholars, but we're not really a direct service provider. Fortunately, like even when our children disclose or families disclose, because we're in partnership with so many people, we talk about like the interdisciplinary work. We use like just referrals, and a friend of a friend will refer the children or their families to get those services. So if it pops up, by default, we may reach out and say, hey, we know someone who could help you, but we don't really handle that stuff like firsthand. And Julie, I don't know if you want to like add on anything.
Well, I was wondering if maybe the question was about what your legal or ethical duty would be to report information to CPS, right? Like if you're a mandated reporter, a teacher, or another person working with children, then you have a duty to report information that may come to you that, putting my lawyer hat on, that suggests a child's been subject to abuse or neglect. And so I will let the providers who are working and developing those policies respond to that question. And just to follow up a little bit on what Hassanah said, the young people that we work in our programs have experiences, certainly, of abuse and neglect, or living in extremely vulnerable and precarious situations. And our program is really not intended to be a direct service response to that trauma. It's intended to be a leadership development and broader sort of connection to employment and education and scholarship. So I'll turn it back to Danielle probably to make have a more
I think you covered it. Like you said, if you're a mandated reporter, your duty to report falls under that guideline, in which case I believe Romu has the link to the hotline, and we can also maybe drop it in the chat. Separate from making a report of child abuse to CPS, Sacred Spaces does have case consultations, which would be when an organization is responding to a case and wants to respond in a way that goes beyond making your legal mandate to report, but also just brainstorming about what it means to support everybody involved, how you communicate what is happening in your organization to the community, how to put resources in place. All of those pieces, if an organization is responding, can definitely contact Sacred Spaces for a case consult. I can drop the link for that too.
And I just want to add that the question mentioned Haruv. So we're not part of that cycle in terms of who to report. But what we do is we offer. This question is exactly why there needs to be training, and it needs to be ongoing for professionals working and interacting with children and youth. Because I think personally, and we do that. So I personally do not know the laws in New York, so I'm not going to give an answer to that, which is not going to be professional. But if I were to do and organize a training in New York, I would bring someone in who is a professional and who knows what the specific law here in this state is. But I just want to say that knowing that reporting is mandated is still not enough. We need to think together and have spaces. And anyone who interacts with youth needs to have spaces to think about, share about, discuss the ethical dilemmas, the moral dilemmas that arise from that. Because the problem is that it's not just knowing that it's mandated or not. The problem is what we do once, once a case arises. Usually reality is much more complex than just reporting or not. That's my 2 cents on it.
And intergenerational, right? Like the bequeathing of the legacy from child, from parent to child, actually from grandparents and more, or any of their guardians. So it has so many layers indeed. There's a question about the link between substance involvement in substances amongst parents and neglect of children. How often is it a normal corollary?
What we know from the studies is that substance abuse is one of the factors related to elevated risk of neglect. So but I think it's kind of it might be a part of a vicious cycle that I think we're all trying to break, because substance abuse by a parent might be a form of self-medication, right, so to speak, regarding their own hurt or their own abuse that they might have gone through. So I personally, as a social worker, I would not only look into the substance abuse, but I would think about why is that parent? And of course, with now thinking about the child, the family, the parent, now it's kind of a more complicated situation, but yeah.
I wanted to ask a question. So one of the things that was so important for me personally, and you spoke about this, and as Danielle, you spoke to this, and I think Danielle, that I wrote the introduction to the Aleinu, to the workbook, and I've been involved very much from the beginning with Shira on this work, and Roman was very proud to be part of the Aleinu campaign, and worked very closely as well with Khalil Bernstein and so on. Like, it's a very big issue for me, and it's why I started the Shabbat of the Child last year, and this year when I spoke about it on a Friday night, I spoke about I used the framing of a football player, Adrian Peterson, who back in 2014 was indicted on for abusing his 4-year-old son, and what's just interesting to me, and just listening to tonight's conversation, and thanking all of you for your insights and for your, all of you are doing such incredible work. I was struck by the difference between the first 2 presenters and then you in particular, Danielle. And here's what I was struck by. There are indeed larger social systems and issues that are at play more broadly in our culture writ large. But when you came to the Jewish community, right, I was sexually abused as a 7-year-old in a affluent, powerful community. My father was the president of the synagogue. We were very much a part of the Jewish community, and it didn't stop me, or actually for that matter, statistically, many others like me, from being abused. And so what I was really struck by was that you focused very much on the internal Jewish culture, and you named factors that were not socioeconomic at all. You named all of the factors that you named were factors that have to do with pedagogy, with how text is used, how people in authority speak about it. And I didn't hear anybody speak to that in the beginning. And that's clearly a piece of this too, which is, to what extent are, in various communities where this is a prevalent issue, are preachers standing up and speaking out against child abuse in those communities? I know that if the Jewish community is not doing it, I can, rest assured that it's probably not happening in other communities too, just venture a guess. And so my question is, what are the larger systemic responsibilities? Not the parts of the culture that are kind of, but how do we move the needle on that? How do we move the needle so that, for example, a woman in our class yesterday morning who grew up in a horrible neighborhood, she said that she heard more gunshots in her community growing up than she heard birds chirping. And it's a phrase that I'll never forget for the rest of my life. And then she went on to extol the virtues of her mother who whipped her, so that she would become someone, she said, who now feels that saved her life. And I had the unenviable position of saying to her in front of all these people, both to hold the horror of the childhood that she had, but also hold up the poisonous pedagogy of, like, not allowing like that, right? To be present, like that's not gonna, And so I wonder more broadly, how do we start getting like, preachers and imams and, people who look to their religion for succor and for sustenance and for support and for structure, but also look to it for truth, to have them preaching from the pulpit and saying, right, it's not okay. It doesn't matter. It's not okay to lift your hand to a child, and it won't work. How do we do that? Anyone?
I'll jump in first just to thank you, and thank you for bringing your experience to this space and for really elevating it from the pulpit and modeling what everybody should be doing in other faith communities. I'll share that I had the experience a few days ago, right before this event. Actually, the Human Flourishing Project at Harvard ran a symposium that brought together world religious faith leaders and political leaders from literally around the world to have this question and to think about also the commonalities that we face across faith communities in terms of responding to this topic. And so I'm hopeful, especially after those conversations and conversations of replicating some of our Aleinu program in other faith communities of what it can look like. But one specific piece is, I think, including spiritual injury and spiritual healing as a component that should be spoken about every time we outline the components of child maltreatment, because we do know from research how much that is a big piece of it. Whether or not the person grows up in a faith community, natural questions someone might have about where was God when this happened to me is one in which I think we know many people ask. And so that would be my hope, I guess, to start having that conversation and using the language of spiritual injury and spiritual healing whenever we talk about this.
I would add to that the Children's Defense Fund work has really found a home, a historic home in the Black church and in faith communities across the country. And, I think the focus has really been on looking at the roots of child vulnerability. And I think while we need to examine and respond to the abuse of children in any setting, we cannot ignore the foundational poverty that underlies 2/3 of all of the types of cases that come to the attention in this system. And when we're talking about what most of the calls to our system are really about, they're about people not having food or people not being able to supervise their children because they have to go to work. And so I think, this work is so nuanced and balanced. We have to protect children. We have to recognize their vulnerability and make sure their needs are met, and abuse cannot happen to them. At the same time, we really have to see how the challenges that children and family face are really rooted in inequity. And that our work on behalf of protecting children really has to be focused in both of those spheres.
I think
But I was asking you, is it happening in the other sphere? So I understand that you're doing that work, but I'm asking is it happening in the other sphere? Because I understand that you're focusing on its roots in inequity, but I wasn't asking about that because that's clear. You made that clear from your presentation. What I am asking is, to what extent do we have metrics on the other sphere? Like, are there organizations, are there people on the ground who are keeping preachers and those who have power in various communities, not only communities of color? I mean, poverty in ultra Orthodox communities in Israel is a real issue, and poverty, there's high incidence in Israel of child abuse as well, and so right. But there's a lot of it that is rooted both in the issue of inequity, issues of economic disparity and economic squalor, and those are real issues. But the question of I'm working on the ground and saying, where are my people who are getting their people to march for children? Like, we march for millions of things that we need to march for, but where are the people when the people next door could be hitting a child? And if you substitute, domestic abuse, any of these other issues, and I sometimes lie awake and I say to my wife, I don't understand. Like, I don't look, I'm not doing enough. I know I'm not doing enough. I'm not doing enough to protect children that are next door. I know how hard it is in this pandemic to have three little kids. And I can imagine if there are other, if there's a history of abuse, if there's economic disparity and there's suffering and stress and pressure. But I'm just wondering, how do we, as spiritual leaders, get people from the pulpits to give one sermon? I'm not even sure, frankly, if I know any other colleague, and maybe I'm wrong about this, Danielle. Is there any other colleague in the Jewish world that is who like? Do we have more than 20 sermons of people over the last 10 years in major pulpits around this country on this issue? Am I 20 sermons?
Rabbi
You're
David, I just
Tell
want
me.
to let you know, for example, that at least at the Jewish Theological Seminary, this is one of the most powerful, didactics that the entire seminary went through. Not just the students, not just rabbinical students, cantorial students, staff. We were set free just to do this work. And I remember a GA and an NYPD cop amongst with experts like all of you, looking at us and saying, if you think that abuse does not happen in your communities just because you hold this tradition and you hold this legacy of Torah, you are wrong. And they said, take the word to the pulpit. And I remember going back to I had a Purim Spiel gig and looking at the kids, and I just thought, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. There are stories that I don't even know.
Yeah.
Right? And so Rabbi David,
Yeah,
your leadership here is
I can't wait. Listen, I can't wait. I know that we're coming short on time, but I can't wait because the irony, of course, is to hear that the seminary is a place where this is alive and well is ironic on a weekend where both on Friday evening and Saturday morning, I preached on a text from the leading halachic decisor in that movement who says it's permissible to strike a child for the sake of discipline with an open hand, to give them a potch or to do it on. He says it's not preferable. We should actually move towards better ways of disciplining children. But in our current, milieu, to have the leading halachic decisor in American conservative Judaism say that it's permissible, so we have a long way to go, clearly. And tonight was certainly another step forward on that journey. And we're so thankful to you, to the four panelists, for the work that you do every day. And we all know that it's a big issue, and it's just the second of hopefully what will be an every year occurrence in the Roman community. A couple of announcements, I think, and some thank yous, and then I'll come back to give a little blessing. Lauren?
Thank you so much, Rabbi David, so much for your heart and your attention to this just immensely important issue, and for your question, which brought it into focus in terms of how the socio-political and the cultural and the personal can mix and meld and be addressed together by all of us together. Toda. So I want to thank, if we can go back to our beautiful, wonderful panelists, Hassanah Smith and Julia Davis from the Children's Defense Fund, New York, Danielle Pitkoff of Sacred Spaces and the Aleinu Campaign, of which we are a member, and Avital Kaye Tzadok of Haruv, USA, which is also a part of Haruv, Israel, which we will attach to in English as well as in Hebrew, even for Haruv, Israel. And of course, we couldn't let the evening go by without a deep and profound thank you to our sponsoring and co-organizing organizations, which are Sacred Spaces and Haruv, the Haruv Institute, and Capitolis, including Gil Modelsis, if I'm saying it the right way, and Capitolis. We are so grateful. I remember him from last year, and we are very grateful for their support and wholehearted support of us. And to continue, I want to make sure that we, before I even say this wonderful thing, that I thank and we thank Rabbi Mira Rivera for her undying support of Romamu social action, of me personally, of Avital, Danielle, and these wonderful panelists, and all of the initiatives among her, like, I think 50 jobs she's doing has held us with love and support. Thank you so much, Rabbi Mira. I want to thank Rabbi Janice, who's also held this weekend, like, oh my goodness, and then right away says it's a team effort because that's who she is. It was so wonderful to be included and uplifted. I want to thank the Romamu marketing department for their hard work for this entire weekend. I would like to thank Aliza Rivka for her beautiful, undying, constant, unwavering support of the committee and this event, and Julia Westbrook, our other moderator this evening, and of course, all of the office. And I can't let the evening go by without announcing home hosting, which is happening on April 23rd. Ooh, the deadline to register is Tuesday, if I have my dates right. So we better get on that. And there are a wonderful cornucopia of offerings there. And of course, this beautiful course that's coming, Teachings and Tools for Living an Elevated Jewish Life, Rabbi David and friends leading this amazing foundations course, which also the application deadline is Wednesday, if I have that right. So we better get on that as well. And then there's a lot of other things coming up. A night of healing, the beautiful and wonderful Alana Brody's B'Shem Hashem concert, where Rabbi David will be president, Hazan Basia will be president. It's going to be just amazing. That is on tomorrow. That's tomorrow at 8 p.m. Yom Ha'atzma'ut with the JCC, the 9th through 18th. The Israeli-Palestinian Joint Memorial Day Ceremony on Tuesday. My goodness, deadlines and events this week, this Tuesday. And the Omer, blow in your mind during the counting of the Omer with Nigel Savage, Karen Freed, Arthur Freed, Kohenet Aliza Rivka, and Rabbi Scott Perlow. And without further ado, let me make sure that I have thanked everybody. Yes, I believe we have. So Rabbi David is going to grace us with a closing benediction, and then we'll have our closing song. And I just want to thank everybody for their presence and their heart and their openness and their time and all of your beautiful faces, which I'm looking at and grateful for. Toda. Rabbi David.
So this brings to a close a very intense weekend, intense in its preparations. We all knew going into this weekend it was coming a week after Pesach, after Passover, and we knew that there would be some Zoom fatigue from all of the different, Sidarim and the activities over Pesach. And in some ways, the 35 of you at 40 at one point are the ones who stuck it out to the end of the weekend. Some of you, maybe for the first time tonight, we welcome you also, but many of you were with us throughout the weekend. And so I want to thank you for that commitment and that perseverance and that aerobic spiritual capacity that allowed you to make it through to the end of this marathon, because for the sake of the children, it was worth it. And I want to thank again, as Lauren said, thank everyone that made this weekend what it was, and especially to Rabbi Elster, who held all of the pieces and oversaw all of the pieces leading up to this evening. And so thank you to you, Rabbi Elster, and to the entire, the Romo community that for whom this is a big issue. And I want to invoke the presence of the one who gives us the courage, the one who reminds us of what it is to be vulnerable and to be limited as human beings. The one in whose presence, if it is a deep and true presence, we feel safe and we feel sheltered. The one called by so many names, but known as, I believe, in one taste, one heart, one experience of mystery before the question of how it is that we are here and what are we to do. And the one who reminds us that where there is love, There is no mountain too high. There is no obstacle too difficult, and there is no cause that might be called impossible that faces us, because love is more powerful than all of those things. And there is no greater love than the love of life itself that brings forth the vulnerability of each and every human soul in those early years of life, where we as individuals, as parents, where we as a country and as a culture and as a global community are obligated to take care, to be shomrim, to be those who safeguard, to watch over, to make sure that those early seeds that are planted become the orchard of love, the orchard of a fragrance known as goodness. We are the ones. We are the ones who irrigate. We are the ones. And so may God, that one known by so many names, empower us from this day to do a little bit more, do a lot more, to walk this talk out to the world, to make this place what it could and should be for all of God's children. May it be so. Amen. Kaye yehi ratzon.
Amen. תודה ותודה. אמן ואמן.
This is our prayer.
Pieces of the brokenness inside. I am light. I am light. Yeah. I am light. I am light. Light as in the opposite of heavy. I am light. I am light. Light as in the best word in the English language to describe the soul. I am light. I am light. I'm not the mistakes that I have made, or any of the things that cause me pain. I am not the pieces of the dreams I left behind. I am light. 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 Quantum physics teaches us that we're really actually mostly space. We are light. I am not the color of my eyes. I am not the skin on the outside. I am not my age. I am not my race. My soul inside is all light. I am light. I am light. I am light. Light is in the heat and fire given off by the combustion of the crucible of life's hard times. I am divinity defined. I am the God on the inside. I am a star, a piece of it all. I am light.
Good night, everyone. Toda. Laila Tov.